Let's jump back into the Gospel of John. We are in John chapter 18, verses 15 through 18. This is about Peter's first denial. Now look at the little bit bigger picture here. In verses 12 through 14, we read about the Lord Jesus. Now in 15 through 18, we read about Peter. Then in 19 through 24, we will read again about the Lord Jesus. Then 25 through 27 is about Peter. And finally, 18:28 through 19:16a, the first part of 16, that's again about the Lord Jesus. As our attention goes back and forth between the Lord Jesus and Peter, we cannot but help compare them. We see the Lord fully in control of himself, and we see Peter panicking and doing the very thing he said he would never do. Chapter 18, verse 15. Now Simon Peter and the other disciple were following Jesus. But that disciple was known by the high priest, and he went in with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. Well, in Matthew 26:56 and Mark 14:50, we read that his disciples fled. But here we read that two of those disciples were following him. This is not a contradiction. Here's how that can be easily resolved. They all fled. Matthew and Mark's account is accurate. They all fled, but after fleeing, Peter and the one called the other disciple decided to return and follow their rabbi from afar. The identity of the one called the other disciple is not stated outright, but in the context of this gospel, the Gospel of John, with the repeated expression, the disciple whom Jesus loved, I think it's pretty clear that this expression is a reference to John, the author of this gospel, and that conclusion is strengthened by the use of the definite article. It does not say another disciple, it says the other disciple. Well, the other disciple, it must be somebody that we're used to calling the other disciple, the disciple whom Jesus loved. I think that's pretty clear. Okay, it's not 100% clear, but I think it's pretty clear. And we know that Peter and John are often together. For example, in chapter 20, verses 2 through 10, and in chapter 21, verses 20 through 24. Well, Carson, in his commentary, Carson agrees and says, the most competent recent evaluation of the evidence concludes, rather tentatively, that the other disciple is the beloved disciple. Even so, the commentary author Michaels rejects this, saying, there is no evidence here to support such a claim. That seems a little bit overly assured that it's not the disciple that Jesus loved. It's not John. I think it was John. Mounts brings up the possibility that John, Mounts says, brought Galilean saltfish to the court of the high priest during the time he worked for his father. That is a possible explanation, but as always, we should separate possible explanations from biblical certainty. The identity of the disciple that Jesus loved is explained in the video discussion on the author of this gospel in this series. Is it possible that John, a fisherman's son, or any other disciple of the Lord, could be known by the high priest such that he could enter the courtyard of the high priest's home at night? In Jewish culture, physical skill was valued. A rabbi teaches and preaches, but he also works with his hands. Remember, the Apostle Paul was a tent maker. The religious leaders did not despise people like John because he was a fisherman, and John's family was wealthy enough to use hired men, as we read in Mark chapter 1, verses 19 and 20. I'll read that. When he had gone a little further, he saw James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John in a boat, preparing their nets. Without delay, he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired men and followed him. There were hired men, so John and his father Zebedee were not poor people. They could hire men to help them with their fishing work. So what this verse says, that John was known to the high priest, would not have been impossible in their culture. It should not surprise us that John does not explain to us how it was that he was known by the high priest. Even though John gives his readers helpful explanations, John says very little about himself. Now, about the word courtyard, this term, aule, can refer to the courtyard of the temple, as in Revelation 11:2. It can also refer to a sheepfold, as in John chapter 10, verse 1. But usually this word, aule, refers to the courtyard of a building. This aule was outside, as we know from Matthew 26:69. In Mark 14:66, Peter was below in the aule, so the aule and Peter had a lower position than some building beside it. Probably the aule was on the ground floor, like a courtyard would be. So very likely, almost certainly, this aule was the courtyard of the high priest's palace. And probably, not certainly, probably, both Annas and his son-in-law Caiaphas had houses there within that complex. Chapter 18, verse 16. But Peter stood outside near the door. So the other disciple who was known by the high priest went out, and he spoke to the doorkeeper, and he brought Peter in. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke recount the events of Peter's denial, but they do not explain how Peter was able to enter the courtyard of the palace of the high priest. Only in the Gospel of John do we read that the other disciple was known by the high priest. We read no more about that other disciple in this setting. Chapter 18, verse 17. So the slave girl, the doorkeeper, says to Peter, "Are you not also among the disciples of this man?" He says, "I am not." The question of the slave girl, doorkeeper, it's natural. We might guess that she was thinking of something like maybe, "I know John, and that he is one of that man's followers. Are you also one of his followers?" Sort of an innocent, harmless question, it seems to be. We can't be sure of the tone of voice that this slave doorkeeper girl used. Peter, who had earlier been so confident, self-confident, now denies his Lord. He doesn't do this before an armed mob. He doesn't do this before the Sanhedrin. He doesn't do this before Governor Pilate. He does it before a slave girl, a doorkeeper. Carson says that perhaps Peter excused himself by thinking, that he had to answer, "I am not," so that he could get closer to the Lord Jesus. Maybe. But the second and third denials were more emphatic. Peter here has opened the door to fear. Again, as Carson points out, Peter's denials shed light on two things concerning the Lord Jesus. One, that the Lord Jesus knew ahead of time all that was about to happen, and two, that at this point he was isolated from even his closest friends on earth. Chapter 18, verse 18. Now the slaves and the servants stood, having made a charcoal fire, because it was cold, and they were warming themselves. Now Peter was with them, standing and warming himself. Now it does say the slaves and the servants stood, but these are not simply household servants. They are huperetai. Since in the Gospel of John this word is almost always used of the servants of the chief priests, these men are almost certainly some of the servants of the Jews, the huperetai of the Jews that came and arrested the Lord Jesus, mentioned in 18:3 and 18:12. Mark and Luke mention this fire, but only John records that it was a charcoal fire. This Greek word is anthrakia. It is interesting to note with Borchert that this Greek word is only used twice in the entire New Testament. It's used here. It's also used in John 21:9. What happened in John 21:9? Well, at the first anthrakia here, Peter denies the Lord Jesus. And at the second anthrakia, the Lord Jesus reinstates Peter. At the first charcoal fire, Peter denies the Lord. And at the only other charcoal fire in the whole New Testament, the Lord Jesus reinstates Peter. Is that a coincidence? It's possible that it's a coincidence, but it does seem like it's not a coincidence and that it's an intentional use of this word. We understand that the slaves and the servants just stood there. Peter, who was usually so brave, could only stand there warming himself. The Lord Jesus faced the high priest alone, without friends. Michaels points out that just as Judas was standing with them, metauton in Greek, metauton in verse 5, here Peter is standing with them, metauton, with them, the same expression. Peter is standing with them. Again, is that a coincidence? Well, metauton is a lot more common. These are common words. Charcoal fire is not as common. So it's possible we're not supposed to draw any conclusions from that. But it is interesting that both Peter and Judas were standing with the Lord's enemies who went to arrest him, the same men. Perhaps John mentions this as a criticism of Peter. Why was Peter standing there enjoying the warmth of the fire with the Lord's enemies? John does seem to like to mention physical things that correspond to the spiritual situation. Note, for instance, that he writes, "It was night when Judas went out from the upper room in 1330. And notice that John records, "It was dawn when the Lord appeared, the light of the world appeared in the temple courts" in 8:2. At this point, the account leaves Peter, and we will read more about the Lord Jesus. However, when our attention returns to Peter, the account will restart with words very similar to these words. Now Peter was with them, standing and warming himself. By way of summary, the story of the Lord's trials and condemnation are interwoven with the story of Peter's 3 denials. We have just read about Peter's first denial in the face of an apparently harmless question by an apparently harmless slave girl that attended the gate of the courtyard.